to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we learn about one of the most important endgames there is in chess, the basics of all endgames, and that are the pawn endgames. When we talk about pawn endgames, we're referring to positions when there are only the two kings and pawns on the board. Let's get started with some very typical motifs in various pawn endgames. Here is our first example, where we can see that white has two pawns on the A file, that's called doubled pawns. Moreover, the more advanced one, the one on A7, is only one square away from promotion, becoming a queen or one of the other pieces. While black, on the other hand, has two connected passed pawns on G3 and H3, but they are one step further from promotion than white's pawn. The only thing that going for black is that it is black's turn. So let's look at this situation. In pawn endgames, when there are passed pawns running, there are two important things. One, if you can catch your opponent's pawn. In other words, if you can get to a square, so when the opponent's pawn is about to promote, you can capture it, and that would be the black king getting to B7 right now. Of course, from F3 to B7 is a long way and would take 4 moves to get there, which obviously black cannot do in one step. So therefore, that's out of question in this case. The only thing black can rely on is the other idea, and that is to promote his own pawns earlier or at least at the same time as the opponent does. And sometimes there is even something special, as you shall see in this endgame. Let's first look what would happen if black would continue by advancing the H pawn, threatening to promote it on the following move to a queen or a rook, and that would be a checkmate. The problem is that in chess we're alternating moves, so after a black move, a white move follows. And in this case, white is the one to promote his pawn first, and generally we're promoting a pawn to a queen. The problem that black has right now is that they do not have the time to proceed with the plan and to promote the H pawn to any piece. Why? It is because the black king right now is in a check from white's queen, and therefore black cannot advance either of the pawns, and once the king would move away, then of course the white king can move in between the two black pawns, for example, and then can win in many different ways, for example promoting a second pawn to a queen and then checkmate with the two queens, or simply pick up the black pawns on G3 and H2 and then win with the king and queen. So from here on it's only a matter of technique. It has been resolved, the problem of stopping the black pawns from promoting has been solved, and the rest is easy. But let's go back to the very beginning where we started. Believe it or not, but actually black can win this game despite what we saw so far. Question is how? Well, if pushing the H pawn wasn't good, then obviously black needs to push the other pawn. The good news is now for black that if the white king runs to E1, then the black pawn will be the one that promotes to a queen, and after the king moves out of the check, black can either just come back to G8 to guard the promotion square, or capture simply white's pawn with another check. The king needs to get out of the check, and then black can just pick up the pawn on A7, and the rest again is easy. Let's go back one more time to the beginning and check out what happens after black advances the pawn to g2 and the white king, of course, goes the other way to g1, not allowing the black pawn to promote. And this is a very important and common pattern in pawn endgames. Now the black king can move to g3, which is a quiet move and obviously does not stop white from promoting the pawn to a8 queen. However, the problem is that black will now play, advancing the pawn by playing h2 checkmate. Isn't that beautiful? Despite white having an extra queen, it is black who is winning. Well, let's move on to some different examples when the priorities will be different. Here we are. What do we see in the current position? We see black having a far advanced pawn on h3, only 2 squares away from the promotion square. However, we also see the white king being right next to it, and that means that whenever that pawn will be ready to advance, the white king will just capture that pawn. So really, white is holding that pawn off. On the other hand, if right now white would capture the pawn immediately, the problem is that black will move the king to f5 and then unavoidably will capture the pawn on e5, then move to d5, then capture the pawn on c5 and have a winning endgame. Yet in this position it is white who can win the game. The big question is how? And here is the answer to that question. White needs to create a passed pawn, and preferably one that cannot be prevented from promoting later to a queen. The problem seems to be that black's pawn on d7 is guarding both squares where white could advance his pawns with e6 or c6. There is a big difference how white continues here. If white mistakenly would continue by advancing the c-pawn, trying to lure black's pawn away from the e6 square and then now to advance the e-pawn, the problem is the black king is close enough and will catch white's passed pawn, and that pawn will never get to promote. And therefore, white should push the other pawn. Now, if the pawn captures c6, and we can see that black's king is just one move too late, white promotes first. On the other hand, if after e6 black continues immediately running with the king, then the pawn is lost, king e7, and white will connect the pawns, protect the d7 pawn with the c6 pawn, then follow up on the next move capturing white's pawn on h3 and walk towards the queen side with his king, helping those two connected passed pawns to advance and later promote. For example, if king d8, king captures, king c6, and the king starts running to the other side. Now if king takes pawn, then the pawn can advance safely. Or if the king keeps waiting, the white king is just coming closer and closer. And now an important moment, not here, because that would be stalemate and the game would end in a draw, but move the king to f7, king c7, king e7, and now the pawn promotes and the rest is easy. This endgame was a very typical example of a situation when we purposefully sacrifice a pawn in order to create a straight line, a free way, a free pass to our other passed pawn. And in this case, that passed pawn was absolutely unstoppable, and therefore the sacrifice was well worth it. Again, we saw this position when we gave up the e-pawn in order to get the road for the c-pawn free. Let's move on to the next example where we'll talk about something relatively similar. Looking at this position, it is white's turn. We can see that the black king on the middle of the board is immediately threatening two pawns, one on each direction. The question is what to do. If white now advances the d pawn forward and black captures and white captures, then white will just lose the pawn. So what to do? How can white win this game? The trick is that after we play d6 and black captures the pawn, we again sacrifice the pawn and simply push through. And here the beautiful part is the cooperation between the two white pawns. The c pawn is running and the f pawn in the meantime controls the important e6 square, and because the black king cannot move there, the black king is unable to catch white's passed pawn on c6. If the king goes around to f6 again, it will arrive too late. A very nice example, and this pattern, by the way, is called the breakthrough. We're breaking through a file, we're forcing away an enemy pawn that was in our way, the one on c7, so our c passed pawn get to advance. Let's move on to our next example where we'll see yet another different pattern. In this example, we also have an extra rook for white, which of course generally is a big advantage. Moreover, white also has a passed pawn on d7 that's about to get promoted, and remember that d8 promotion square is protected by white's rook. It is black's turn in this position, and the question is, how can black save the game or even win it? If right now black would continue with the natural move king capturing the pawn on d7, then white would respond by playing rook to g8. And now what we can see is that each of the white pieces is holding off one of the black pawns. In case either of them promote, one of the white pieces will capture that newly born queen. So let's go back again to the beginning and think, what should black do? Well, you may think, how about promoting the pawn on g1? The problem with this is that white will also promote safely and moreover with a check. So therefore black doesn't have the time to promote a second pawn to a queen. The black king will be forced to move, and now the cooperation between the rook and the queen can begin, and white will win. Also, the pawn on c2, of course, could be captured, and that would result white remaining with an extra rook. But it's best to simply start giving the checks, and if white is giving the correct checks, black will get checkmated rather soon. So let's go back, because obviously this is not how black can win the game. And believe it or not, black can win this game. And here is a very important and common pattern that black can win the game with. Namely, to again first sacrifice one of the pawns by promoting it to a queen with a check. If now white does not capture the queen, then on the next move black could simply capture white's pawn on d7. On the other hand, if the king does capture the new queen, then already when black promotes the other pawn, this will be a check, and then when the king gets out of the check, black will simply, for example, give a check or could capture the pawn on d7, but it's more powerful to give the check first, and if black gives the correct checks, black can actually win the white rook that's in the corner. How? by forcing the white king into a position where it will be a fork. King b3, queen d5 check, king a3, queen d3, king a2, queen c2, and now white has no choice but move to one of the dark squares, for example on a3, and finally we found a check that's not only of course attacking the king but the rook as well. So that would be called a fork when we attack two enemy pieces simultaneously. A very nice example on how to gain time in forcing the opponent's king onto a square when we can promote a pawn with a check. And giving a check means gaining time because you limit your opponent's choices. One always needs to react to a check. You cannot ignore, you cannot just follow with your own plans. When you're in check, you need to get out of it. Let's move on to the next example when we see that white has two extra pawns. However, we can also see that one of those pawns is about to be lost. We can see that the white king is too far to protect it, and none of the other white pieces, the other pawn, cannot directly protect it either because they are a file apart. Yet, white can still indirectly protect that pawn by advancing the c pawn forward. What happens now is that if black captures the pawn anyway, then the pawn and now advancing the pawn forward, and we can see that the black king cannot stop the promotion of the c pawn. On the other hand, if after c6 black does not capture the pawn, but for example moves to e7, then already the white king will come to the rescue of those white pawns, moving forward, simply moving forward and protecting it, and then the position is easily winning. Let's move on to the next example, where we'll yet again see another pattern. And in this example, as well as in the following, what will happen is that both pawns will get promoted at the same time. In other words, one after another. Yet, one side will win. And in this case, it was white's turn, and therefore white will win the game. White is advancing the pawn forward, so does black. White promotes the pawn first, but black promotes the pawn right away. Now it's important to know that generally speaking, when each side only has a king and queen, and the opponent has the same material, also a king and queen, the game typically is a draw if both sides play normal, without blundering. However, there are special situations, and that's exactly what I'd like to point out, when the king and the queen of the same color end up being on the same file, rank, or diagonal. For example, in this case, white can create a so-called skewer by moving the queen to d7, checking the king, and once the king moves out, left or right, it doesn't matter, the white queen will capture black's queen, and it's game over. Let's see the next example, which is very similar to what we just saw. In this case, it is white's turn, and it seems that the best thing to do is to capture black's last and only pawn. However, that would give the win away. Why? Because after king takes pawn, the black king gets close enough to white's pawn to get there on time. When the pawn would be ready to get promoted, the black king will simply capture it on h8. So, what should white do? White still needs 3 moves to promote his own pawn, while black only needs 2. Nevertheless, that's the correct choice of action. Advance the pawn, let black promote his pawn first, and after the black pawn promotes, so does the white pawn, but very importantly, with a check. And as you can see now, the white queen and the black king and the black queen all find themselves on the same diagonal. What does that mean? It means, just like in the last example, that we see a perfect example of a skewer. And it means that the black king is in check, and once the black king moves out of that check, the white queen captures the black queen, and we again reached a technically easily won endgame. And here is the last example for this lesson. Here we are. In the position in front of us, white has an extra pawn, but the pawn on g6 is about to get lost. The question is what to do. Should white run after black's pawn, or should white try to somehow protect his own pawn on g6? Let's first check out what happens if white would try to run after black's pawn. And keep running. Things would not end well, because white would lose both pawns while win only black's one last pawn. And of course, with only the 2 kings left on the board, the game automatically is over and it's a draw. So let's go back. Obviously, the white king right here is unable to protect the pawn on g6. And it seems that if white now protects the pawn with his other pawn, with f5, that pawn would be captured. However, if black captures that pawn, then the g-pawn runs away and will promote on the very next move. And what happens if after f5, black starts pushing his own pawn? Fortunately for white, the king is close enough, and now, as you can see, white needs 1, 2, 3, and so does black. So when the numbers are equal, then the pawn will be caught. 1, 1, second move, and when the pawn promotes, then the white king captures it, and it's game over. So it's very important to remember in such positions, when you do have 2 pawns on files next to each other, that if the pawn that's behind protects the pawn in front, that pawn, assuming that there are no other pieces on the board, cannot be captured without allowing the other pawn to advance and then to get promoted. So what did we learn in this lesson about these different pawn endgames? First, we saw an example where in the first example, black even could allow the opponent to promote his pawn to a queen because the white king was in a checkmate position. Then we saw a couple examples on how to create a passed pawn by sacrificing one of our other pawns. Then we saw how it's important the timing, and namely to arrive promoting the pawn to a queen with a check in cases when the opponent wants to do the same. Then we saw some examples of skewers when one pawn gets promoted right after another, and there are situations if the new queen and the king finds itself on the same line, whether it's a line, a rank, a file, or a diagonal, there oftentimes could be a check, a very powerful check, which is a skewer, and wins the newly born queen. And then in our last position, we saw how pawns on neighboring files can very effectively protect each other. Well, I hope you learned a lot in this lesson, and you know a lot more about pawn endgames now than you did before this lesson. Thank you for listening, and be back for the next lesson. So long until then. Bye-bye.